Welcome to the London Business School webinar series, Leading Through a Pandemic. I'm Julian Birkinshaw. I'm the host of this series, and I have been the host for the entire series. I think this is now our 15th episode. And today we're going to be talking about some of the bigger picture issues around the business world, particularly this notion of what makes a business responsible. So the topic is responsible business in a time of crisis. And joining me to discuss this are two colleagues. First of all, Professor Alex Edmans, who is a professor of corporate finance at London Business School and also the director of our Centre for Corporate Governance. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Julian. It's great to be here.
Perfect. And also with us is Tom Gosling, who is the executive fellow of the Centre for Corporate Governance and also a partner at PwC, the professional services firm. Tom, welcome.
Great to be here. Thank you, Julian.
Perfect. So I hope you enjoy the events. I'm now going to hand over to Alex to get us started. Alex.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Julian, and thank you for the leadership you've shown throughout this entire webinar series on the pandemic. So what Tom and I hope to speak about is responsible business in a time of crisis. So how should responsible businesses react to this crisis based on both academic evidence and also practitioner experience? And perhaps a good place to start is to define what does it mean to be a responsible business to begin with. And many of us will have been locked down for maybe 1 or 2 months, but let me take you around the world, at least metaphorically, to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents, from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains and some of the world's deepest lakes across 6,000 kilometers. And one of the lakes it has is Lake Magadi. And that is in the southernmost point of the Great Rift Valley. So this is where it's in Kenya. Now, you might think you've not actually seen Lake Magadi before, but actually some of you will have seen it in the movie The Constant Gardener, based on the John le Carré novel of the same name. But while millions of people will have seen Lake Magadi through this movie, actually fewer than 1,000 people call Lake Magadi their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Songa, who makes his living herding goats. Now, it used to be cash that Emmanuel would receive when he sold a goat. Then he would need to check that cash for forgery, store it at risk of robbery, and then he'd have to trek for an entire day to go to a bank to deposit that cash in a bank account. And because of that, he had to graze his goats close to the bank. He couldn't graze them in the greenest pastures. But all of that changed in 2007 due to a responsible business. And that business is a UK telecoms company known as Vodafone. So what did Vodafone do? And some of you will know this story. They launched M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Kenya. So let me take 30 seconds to explain what mobile money is, because some people get it confused with mobile banking. So mobile banking is I have a Barclays bank account. I can access it on the phone rather than using a branch. But with mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. And that's really powerful because many Kenyans were unbanked. So this really transformed Emmanuel's life. So no longer does he need to worry about cash. He can take payments on his phone. He can focus on his vocation, which is tending his flock and graze them on the greenest pastures. And his accounting is much easier because he now has a record of transactions on his phone. But we don't want to make a big thing about just one story. We want large-scale evidence. And a study by some faculty at MIT found that in the first 7 years of launching M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty. And many of those households were headed by women because it allowed them to transition from agriculture to retail and business. So there were a lot of knock-on effects in terms of gender diversity. And far beyond business, it allowed parents to pay for their children's education and also adults to pay for their parents' health expenses. So this launch of M-Pesa had a huge impact on society. So that's one story, which is about Vodafone. But let me talk about another story. And this is, in 2012, Vodafone became the first company in the telecoms industry around the world to launch a tax transparency report showing how much tax they were paying to governments worldwide. And that's really important in telecoms, right? Because you could have your licenses in low tax countries. So I've got a question for, actually two questions for everybody here. First is, which of these decisions created most value for society? And second is, which of these decisions, if you hadn't taken those decisions, would have led to the most public outrage or worsened Vodafone's corporate social responsibility reputation? Now, I know that we have a polling function and Tom's going to launch some polls later, but I'm not actually going to poll you on this part because I'm pretty sure everybody would have the same response. It was the first decision, M-Pesa, that created most value for society, right? It launched 200,000 households out of poverty. But it's the second decision which was most important for the rating and reputation. Why? Because what is the public backlash if you do not innovate? It's nothing. Right? Had Vodafone not launched M-Pesa, there would have been no backlash because society would have never expected Vodafone to think of this great idea to begin with. But what is the backlash if you don't pay taxes fairly or you don't pay fair wages? It is significant and substantial. And so some of you might know that Vodafone actually had a store boycott a few years earlier due to not paying what people thought was as fair tax. So don't get me wrong, paying tax fairly and treating employees fairly is absolutely critical for a responsible business. But why I start the talk with this is perhaps to change your views on responsible business. Probably everybody knew before joining this webinar that it was about treating society fairly. But what we want to stress is responsible business is also about innovation and actively creating social value. So we think about the value that a company creates as being given by a pie. We often think responsibility is about ensuring a fair split of the pie. So that pie could either go to investors, that's the blue in the form of profits, or society in terms of the orange, and that could be taxpayers in the form of taxes, workers in the form of fair wages, but also more generally fair working conditions, and customers in the form of not being price gouged and so forth. And responsibility involves splitting the pie differently so that investors don't take too much of. That's at least the traditional view. But there are at least two problems with that traditional view. The first is that, well, this seems to be bad for business because profits become lower. And if it's indeed something which is bad for business, right, it's something that business people might not voluntarily accept, right, if it makes things worse off in terms of profits. So the only way to achieve this is to have regulation. And don't get me wrong, there is a role for regulation. You can, but that doesn't do anything about meaningful work or flexi-time work policy. Famously, Henry Ford paid $5 a day. That was a lot back in the 1920s, but gave workers very routine jobs with no skills development. And the second reason why there's a limit to this idea is that, well, the idea of reducing what investors get and giving more to stakeholders, that sounds politically appealing, but that has a them and us mentality. Right? Investors are them, stakeholders are us, and let's reduce the slice given to them. But that's not right, because investors are not just them, they are also us. They involve parents saving for their children's education, pension funds investing for their retirees, and insurance companies laying to fund future claims. So any reform of business must absolutely take investors seriously. And so that's why I launched the stories to begin with. So these aren't just sort of inspirational stories, but this highlights what responsibility is about. It's not about splitting the pie differently, but growing the pie, actively creating social value and increasing the orange. But we do this not by keeping the status quo and just changing the division, but by innovating. And the beauty of this is not only does society benefit, but also investors benefit, the blue goes up. And so the definition of a responsible business is to create profits only through creating value for society. Okay, so before coming on this webinar, you would have understood the importance of creating value for society, but creating profits is also critical for the reasons that I suggested. And why can you get to that from the latter? Well, it's because if you make something like M-Pesa, well, that was driven by the idea of solving a social problem, right? Ultimately and unexpectedly, Vodafone could benefit. So they were able to monetize it, and also employees were attracted to work for this company because it was a purposeful company. Okay, so you might think, isn't this just too good to be true, right? The idea that both investors and society can benefit simultaneously, that might seem to be a pipe dream, but actually it's backed up by a lot of rigorous evidence. Now, normally if I was to give a webinar, I'd go through multiple slides on the evidence, but I actually won't, because I'm going to hand over to Tom to talk about what this means in practice. But what I'll say is this is backed up by a lot of rigorous evidence. I've actually written a book on this just a Grow Pie, how great companies deliver both purpose and profit. And this is not so much to plug the book, but just to say what we're talking to you about is not just something which sounds nice, but is backed up by data. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Tom. He'll talk about what this means directly for the coronavirus crisis.
Thank you, Alex. So Alex has described how a focus on growing the pie can increase value for all stakeholders. But how should a responsible company act if the pie's shrinking, as is happening in many cases now? How should it allocate those costs between executives and employees, shareholders, and other stakeholders? So let's start off with a poll. If we could move to the first poll, please. So do you think it's acceptable for a company that has received government support through a credit or wage scheme to pay their CEO a bonus? And you've got three options here. Either no, when a company's been kept afloat by the taxpayer, the CEO shouldn't receive a bonus, or perhaps a small bonus might be justified, but it should be lower than normal. Or finally, yes, we still need to incentivize CEOs to grow the pie for all stakeholders. So you could give your responses to that question. And then when we're ready, if we could just see the answers to that poll. Okay, just whenever you're ready with the responses, here we come. And what's really interesting about this is that the overwhelming majority of you believe that either there should be no bonus in this circumstance or that the bonus should be reduced. And if we were to think about this purely rationally, it's not obvious why this is the case, because CEOs are working harder than they've ever worked before. And we're also at a time when actually the decisions that leaders make for their company could be absolutely profound in terms of the future of those organizations. But what we see here is that notwithstanding that, there's this sort of very instinctive sense of fairness that suggests that actually when the overall economy and companies are suffering because of a crisis like the one we have now, the best paid leaders in their company, should also bear at least their fair share of the pain. And indeed, they're probably better placed to share the pain. And so could we return now to the main presentation and to the next slide, please? And we've seen this issue really explode onto the scene since we went into lockdown and saw the profound impact that the government intervention was going to have on the economy. The chart on the left just shows the article count from the London Financial Times around stories about executive pay. And you see the exponential growth at the point at which we went into lockdown around the end of March. And we've seen policymakers, politicians, and even investors really urging executives to share the pain of the crisis with other stakeholders. And part of this has been the result of a desire not to repeat the mistakes of the financial crisis, which in many respects has entered the public imagination as having been a bailout of boardrooms and bonuses as opposed to ordinary workers. And whilst I think that's an unfair characterization of the impact of the government support that was given in 2008-9, that is what has entered into the common consciousness in many respects. And therefore we've seen growing political pressure for executive pay conditions to be linked to government support schemes. And interestingly, in the US, Congress explicitly included in the CARES Act restrictions on executive pay, although here in the UK the government did not do that. But I think we will see them coming up with rather a lot of efforts to morally pressure companies to show restraint on executive pay. And we will see also shareholders, I think, responding to that. But more positively, rather than just seeking to avoid criticism, we're also seeing great company leaders looking to show solidarity with stakeholders through taking executive pay cuts. And we're seeing them respond also to requests from investor bodies such as the Interfaith Centre for Corporate Responsibility, who have asked companies to show themselves to be trustworthy and compassionate. And I think that what we've seen is that given all that has been written and said about responsible business in recent months and years, this crisis will to some degree be viewed as a test case for how companies react and whether actually words are matched by deeds. We could go to the next slide, please. And in response to this, we've seen around 1 in 4 companies in the US and UK take action on executive pay. And there are organizations that are tracking this. There's an organization called Just Capital in the US, a not-for-profit, which is tracking all of the stakeholder actions that companies are taking, including on executive pay. And we have seen a whole range of actions taken, from contributions to charitable foundations, bonuses being suspended, through actually to salary cuts. So let's now go to the next poll slide. So let's just see what actions your own organisation has taken on senior executive pay. And because we've seen a range of options taken, you can choose more than one in this case. So perhaps senior executives have had a salary freeze, so they've foregone salary increases, or maybe actually salaries have been cut. Maybe they've made voluntary charitable donations, or foregone or delayed their bonuses or option and LTI awards. Or perhaps you're in a company where none of the above has happened. And what we've seen, and as we'll come on to after this poll, there's really a wide variety of actions that companies are taking dependent on their particular circumstances. But when you're ready, let's perhaps see the results from that poll and see what we're finding amongst the audience of today's webinar. So really a wide range of cuts, which is, a wide range of actions, which is reflected in the diversity that we're seeing in the market. Although what's quite interesting here is that whilst amongst listed companies, the data so far that I showed had suggested that 1 in 4 companies had taken action on senior executive pay. Here we've got 2/3 of respondents showing action having been taken. That might just reflect the fact that this is an incredibly fast-moving situation, and we're seeing decisions being taken daily on these matters. And so it may simply be that data that was taken a week ago in preparation for this seminar has now been superseded by events. So thank you for your responses to that. And if we move back to the main presentation and thank you. So the factors to consider in relation to the actions that might be taken. What we've seen is that executive salary cuts have really been focused on those industries that have experienced the most extreme financial strain. So companies like airlines, bricks and mortar retailers, hospitality and leisure, whose revenues have really been switched off overnight. And there's been a strong principle here of consistency with workforce treatment. If workers are being asked to take pay cuts or are being furloughed, then executives, from a principle of solidarity, have to take pay cuts too. When it comes to payment of bonuses, we've really seen 2 main considerations. One has been whether the dividend has been suspended. Now this, on the face of it, is rather a strange one, because we've seen a number of investors take quite a strong position that if dividends aren't paid, then bonuses shouldn't be paid either. But if a company doesn't pay a dividend, they haven't buried the cash or set fire to it. It's still within the company. And logically, we should be incentivizing executives to take the best decisions for the company, rather than incentivizing them to pay a bonus. To pay a dividend under all circumstances. But I think what this shows is that there are strong instinctive principles of fairness that all stakeholders feel, even very well-informed stakeholders like shareholders, and these aren't always completely rational. And these more emotive aspects around fairness do need to be borne in mind by companies as they respond to this crisis. The second factor around executive bonuses relates to the nature and extent of government support. Where a company has received significant government support to pay workers, for example, then it's going to be very difficult at the end of the year for them to justify paying a bonus to senior executives, because the public will simply view that bonus as having been paid for by the taxpayer. And indeed, the level of government support in the economy is so pervasive that I think we may see quite a broad view taken of what it means to receive government support. And indeed, it may be difficult for many organisations to say that they have not received government support, given how widespread taxpayer intervention in the economy has been. The final issue is around long-term incentives, where shareholders have had a concern that companies making executives share option awards or long-term incentive awards at depressed share prices and with targets set lower because of the pessimism about the economy could end up receiving outsized gains in 3 years' time if the economy recovers faster than expected. And so I think there'll be an expectation that boards apply good judgment and discretion to make sure that windfall gains, unjustified windfall gains, aren't received. And overall, I think we're going to need to see boards applying a common sense test. So how will ordinary citizens look at the decisions that boards are making as they get reported around this time next year, when we've come out of what is probably a very nasty and deep recession with significant increases in unemployment and hardship for many citizens? We could move on to the next slide. I hope that we won't just see a focus on the perhaps more defensive actions that companies are taking around executive pay, but also see recognition of the positive stakeholder actions that companies are taking. And I've given 5 examples here of actions that companies are taking for the benefit of employees. And there's been a lot of focus on protecting workers through this crisis. So these range from making commitments around sustaining employment and pay for a period of time, perhaps increasing employee benefits that are particularly relevant to the current circumstances, or in the case of Tesco, which is a large UK supermarket chain, paying bonuses to store workers who are continuing to work in very challenging circumstances. But does it make sense to be making all of these sort of benefit payments and enhancements in favour of employees? Isn't it important for companies to retain profitability in order to be sustainable and to get through the crisis? Well, we can sometimes see really outsized gains from some of these stakeholder investments. So following the financial crisis, Barry Waymiller, the US electronic components manufacturer, lost about 40% of their revenues overnight and needed to make some very significant cost cuts. But the CEO, Bob Chapman, didn't take the conventional route of laying off employees. He instead decided that those costs should be shared across the company. So executives gave up their bonuses and all employees were asked to take a month's unpaid leave, which they were able to use to benefit from courses and personal development through the Barry Waymiller University. And this had really sort of outsized gains because they ended up achieving double the cost target that they set. They got through the financial crisis without laying anybody off. And actually, through employer loyalty and innovation, came to great success in the recovery that followed. And the CEO, Bob Chapman, felt that this really reinforced their culture of truly human leadership. Now that's just a story, but more systematically, my co-presenter Alex Edmans has done research that shows the benefits of strong employee engagement in relation to long-term returns for companies. And so these investments can really have a multiplicative effect. But it's not always the case. There is counter evidence. So Yanis Yiannopoulos, one of the other presenters earlier in this webinar series, showed evidence that in the last financial crisis, actually it was the companies that did save costs in the workforce, but maintained investments in innovation and other ESG investments that performed better after the crisis. So these are difficult judgments for companies to make. And so we need to think about principles that can help with decision making. And there are 3 that I think are particularly useful, and these come from Alex Edmans' book, Grow the Pie, that help with companies to decide which stakeholder investments they should focus on. So these are multiplication. So a dollar that you invest in a stakeholder investment should deliver much more of a dollar than a dollar of social value to those stakeholders. The second is comparative advantage. Your organization should be particularly well placed to deliver those benefits for that stakeholder group. And then thirdly, materiality. The stakeholder group that you're benefiting should be material to your business, and you should be material to that stakeholder group. And if those three principles all apply, and often they'll be connected, then this gives the greatest chance that that stakeholder action will lead to long-term value for the company, shareholders, and all of its stakeholders. And indeed, these 5 companies here have all given examples of these sorts of investments. So Unilever has donated 100 million euros of sanitary products to developing nations, and they've also provided $500 million of credit relief to suppliers. Apple are adapting their technology to help with track and trace technology in relation to looking at infection rates in the crisis. Microsoft, through their core business, are helping people get up and running with home working, but are also investing in educational units to help teachers who are homeschooling. Standard Chartered have made $1 billion of loan financing available for companies that are particularly focused on fighting COVID-19. And Tesco are expanding their online delivery capability and also making slots available for key health workers and vulnerable citizens. So all of these companies have ways of using their distinctive assets to help fight the crisis. And I think that if we focus on these principles of multiplication, comparative advantage, and materiality, we have a much greater chance of achieving stakeholder investments that grow the pie rather than just split it. So Alex, back to you.
I understand. I saw from the Q&A that there was issues with the bandwidth, so I apologise for that. We practiced it earlier, half an hour ago. There was no issues then, so there must be just bandwidth restrictions. So as a result, I'm just going to turn off the screen sharing when I go to just the final part before the Q&A. And so what Tom just talked about was a number of great examples of companies acting responsibly, which I would call pie splitting actions, where investors and executives are taking their share of the burden to help others. For example, as Tom mentioning, giving unlimited sick leave or continuing to pay workers, or giving 100 million euros of sanitary products. But the problem with that is that that sounds inspiring, but what if you're a company that just can't afford to do that? If you don't have 100 million euros lying around to give, or like Apple, it's easy for them to give sick leave because they're worth $1 trillion. But what if you're a small business? What part can you play in this crisis? So this is why I'm going to go back to the idea of growing the pie that I mentioned right at the start. A responsible business, it's not only about splitting the pie differently, and some companies can't do that. It's about growing the pie and being innovative, just like Vodafone was able to do that with M-Pesa. And so one set of companies for which this is relevant is for companies that are not directly related to the crisis. So Tom talked about Unilever, and it makes sense that Unilever can help out because Unilever makes food and sanitizer. But what about for most companies which don't have anything that they can give because they're not in a relevant industry? Well, this goes back to the idea of growing the pie and thinking innovatively. And so I think the question that any business leader, or I think any citizen, regardless of your position within an organization, should ask, is the question, what is in your hand? So what resources does your company have, or do you have, that you can think innovatively about how it can serve society? So for Vodafone, what was in their hand was communication technology. And they thought about, well, how can they use this to solve the lack of financial inclusion in Kenya? But similarly, let's say you're Chelsea Football Club, right? You don't clearly have anything relevant to the crisis, right? Football tickets and replica merchandise don't really help. But what is in your hand is that Chelsea Football Club have a hotel, and they are allowing doctors and nurses to stay at that hotel after a day shift in a hospital so that they don't have to commute the hour back home. And similarly, another sports team, the New England Patriots, what is in their hand is a jet, and they use that jet to fly 1.2 million N95 masks from China to Boston. So even two sports teams in completely unrelated industries can help out by thinking innovatively. But what about big companies who have been hit? Right, people are now saying, the media are saying, do the right thing and continue to pay your workers if they're furloughed. But what if you're Qantas Airlines, right? Your business has been decimated and it's just not commercial to keep paying your workers. you're going to go bankrupt and the workers then won't have any jobs. But what is in their hand is a relationship. And that relationship is with Woolworths, which is a grocery store in Australia. Now, currently, that relationship is such that if you go and buy groceries in Woolworths, you can also earn air miles. But they've thought innovatively, how can we use that relationship? And what they've done is they're now putting this relationship into a redeployment one, where the furloughed employees from Qantas can now work at Woolworths. And this grows the pie in many dimensions. So the workers still have an income and a purpose, but it also helps society because there's excess demand for grocery stores, and it now enables those workers to serve a major social need. But what about for small companies, right? If you don't have 100 million euros lying around. So let me give an example of a company called Barry's Boot Camp, which is a boutique gym where I mention it because I am actually a client of this gym. So what can they do? They've only got 6 studios in London, but they've got others around the world. So one thing they're offering is free online fitness classes, which are really important for people who are self-isolating at home. But you might think, well, you don't need to be too innovative as a fitness company to offer free fitness classes. So here's where I think the example is really great. What if you're a receptionist at Barry's Boot Camp, right? You work on the reception desk when you check in. How can you help right now? Well, what it turns out is that many of those receptionists are actually actors as their main job, but because acting is a volatile career, they also take this desk job for some income stability. So what is in your hand if you're an actor? You've got great entertainment skills. Well, how does that help in the crisis? Well, what we have right now is a lot of working parents with their kids not at school and at home. So what they're offering is free online entertainment, such as Zoom storytelling sessions to children. And that makes a huge difference to working parents. And I think this is a great example because it shows a company in a completely unrelated industry, which is fitness, using what is in their hand in a very innovative way. And people often talk to me and they say, well, responsibility, right, isn't that something which you can only do once you're massively successful? It's a luxury. First pursue profit. And once you're successful, then you can help society. Well, that's indeed true. If you think purpose is about pie splitting, only once you're huge can you start making donations. But if we think about purpose as pie growing, thinking about what is in our hand to serve society, I think that's something that everybody can do, including small businesses. So clearly the crisis is devastating for everybody. But I think if there's one small silver lining to this crisis, it's that it will encourage business leaders to think permanently about what is in their hand and how they can use that to serve society. And indeed, we've seen things such as perfume manufacturers pivot towards making sanitizer, or clothes manufacturers making gowns, and the idea of using these limited resources in innovative ways that could really reduce resource usage on the economy going forwards. I'm also going to have a couple of minutes on citizenship before we open it up to Q&A. Because what happens, not everybody here will be the CEO of a business. So what can we do as ordinary citizens to create value? Well, again, to ask, what is in our hand? What can we do? And one thing that we can do is indeed to use our own actions. Now, it's not hyperbole to say that our actions could actually save lives. If you choose to self-isolate or not to panic buy, that has an effect on other people's lives. But more generally, rather than just avoiding negative externalities, what are the positive externalities that were embodied and healthy? And so there are many people who are now doing grocery shopping for the elderly and vulnerable neighbors. Or I have a friend who's a lawyer. What is in his hand? Well, he's lucky that he's affluent, and so he's able to do things such as advance purchase 300 coffees from his local coffee shop, and that provides them with much needed liquidity. And what's great about this is that what we've seen in the crisis is people's actions inspiring others. So when a couple of people in your friend group or posting on social media do certain things, other people follow suit. And what I call this is about activating the silent majority, or creating a tipping point. So it wasn't that everybody used to be selfish before the crisis and everybody is selfless. Everybody presumably had this altruism locked inside them, and it was activated by a couple of selfless actions. And people, when we go back to business, people often ask me, and they say, well, my business is not purposeful. How can I think about implementing purpose when everybody focuses on short-term profit? I used to work for an investment bank, so I sort of understand these concerns. But actually, we think about the silent majority. There might be many people who joined the firm whose passion it was to provide honest, trusted advice to clients. And maybe they are the silent majority. And a couple of actions of people sticking their head above the parapet can activate the purpose in other people and create a tipping point, just like we've now seen in the crisis. Okay, so thank you very much to everybody for listening. I'm just going to go back to the screen sharing. Why? Because I see that there's a lot of questions, which is great. We'll try and get to them, as many of them as possible. But to the extent that you've got questions and you don't get a chance to have them answered, here are our contact details. We'll be very happy to answer them by LinkedIn or by email. Thank you very much to everybody for their attention, and I'll hand back to Julian now.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Tom, as well. So lots of questions, as always. We've got about, way over 2,000 people on this call, just in case anybody was wondering what the numbers are. I'm going to start with a couple of I'm going to say, standard questions that you always get when you start talking about responsibility of business. How do we manage the demands from the investors who want short-term profits? I know you've answered that question 1,000 times before, both of you, but just help us with that one, if you would. We've got this perception that investors are not prepared to take any sort of compromises on their short-term profits. Who wants to take that?
I'll start with the evidence, which is sort of my comparative advantage, and I'll move on to Tom. So in terms of, firstly, I think it's just to present the evidence that a number of these factors do pay off in the long term. So if an investor has more than a horizon of a couple of months, they should be willing to support these investments. And so what it requires you to do as a company is to report on what you're doing. And that reporting can be in the form of sustainability reports or annual reports. But I'd also like to stress that communication with investors is far more than just reporting. So it often involves a meeting with investors and saying, well, the value of our company is far more than just our financial numbers. And Unilever, which Tom mentioned in a different context, is useful here because some of you will know that a couple of years ago, they received a takeover bid by Kraft. Normally, when a company receives a takeover bid, management comes and defends themselves. Interestingly, it was investors who came and made the defense because Unilever had spent a lot of time with the investors explaining what the value of the business was, the sustainable living plan, the move away from, say, peat and palm oil. And so the investors said, well, you're not paying us enough of a price. We understand the true value of the business here. We are going to look beyond short-term profit.
Good. Actually, in the interest of time, and there are lots of questions, Tom, I'm not going to ask you to add to this. I'm going to ask another question. Is there a rule of thumb about what percentage should be split between investors and stakeholders? I mean, you showed the two pie charts. I mean, obviously those were indicative rather than numbers, but can we quantify this split in any sense? I mean, either of you can have a stab at answering that. Maybe that was Tom.
Yeah, I mean, happy to. No, I don't think there's a rule of thumb because it's really going to depend on the balance of stakeholder inputs that you have. So, clearly, if you have a very capital-intensive business and needs a lot of financial capital, there is going to have to be a bigger share of the pie that goes to investors than is the case if you have a business that is highly dependent on intangible assets, which may include external relationships with stakeholders. So I'm afraid this is something that does need to be viewed a bit on a case-by-case basis. But I would also say that with all of these frameworks, we need not to be afraid of the fact that we can't always quantify it. And I think one of the problems that we've had from time to time is that through a focus on things that can have a precise number put on it, that can lead actually in its own right to sort of short-termism, because it's much easier to put a number on kind of short-term profit impacts in a spreadsheet than it is to quantify some of these broader stakeholder impacts, even though actually they're often more quantifiable than people think. So I'm afraid we can't provide a ready rule of thumb on that.
No, indeed, I can't say I'm too surprised, but it is a very fair point. If we try to quantify everything, we run the risk that actually we come to answers which are actually absolutely exactly wrong rather than roughly right,
Yeah.
if you see what I mean. So here's a question, nice question. Executives running companies, isn't it their job to secure their company against future crises? In other words, if the company finds itself, going close to the wall, even in crazy times like this, is it their failure? In other words, I guess the question is, to what extent should the executive be managing against all possible downturns versus actually maximizing for the rather more normal kind of distribution of activities and risks that they face? Tom,
I think this is a really interesting question. And, one of the things that this crisis has exposed is the fact that we were operating in many businesses on pretty thin margins of resilience.
Right.
And I think that probably we're going to see a strategic shift towards greater buffers of resilience. But there's always a question about how much of a buffer do you want? I mean, I think that if every company had stockpiled enough cash to deal with a shutdown of the economy for 6 months, then that would have led to a grotesque misallocation of capital. And indeed, one of the worries I think that investors have about companies not paying dividends is that actually there's a desire amongst investors to make sure that the reallocated capital is getting to the businesses that really need it and will be successful in the future, rather than being hoarded by businesses who are sort of slowly destroying value. So I don't think it's reasonable to expect that every business can survive a crisis of this type. Having said that, I do think that, coming back to the pay issue, most CEOs and companies do recognize that whether it's their fault or not, if the company's going really close to the wire, then executives have to share the pain of that.
Alex, do you want to comment on this one? Because it's quite an important question.
No, I think Tom's answered it really well. There's lots of questions, so I'm just mindful of that.
So, and I know you guys are monitoring them. So if there's one towards the end that you really want to answer that I haven't asked, let me know. But let me give you a few more. So one question was, will the pandemic accelerate, the shift in paradigm to social responsibility? You sort of answered that, but I want to ask the kind of the supplementary, which is, isn't there surely a risk that we just fall back into old behaviors once we're out of this? It's very easy for people to say the world has changed fundamentally, but actually, if we look back to the global financial crisis, an awful lot of bad behavior surfaced again fairly soon afterwards.
I think there's always that risk, but that's why I think, again, evidence is useful, is that the evidence suggests that actually responsibility is not just an optional extra to be done when there's a crisis and you need to create good public relations, but it's something which is material for the business in the long term. And so what I've seen over my 15 years as a professor is a shift between something which was always part of just the corporate social responsibility department to now something which is a CEO level issue. And indeed, in terms of investors, these were things which only socially responsible investors cared about, but now all investors care about them. We often have the term non-financial for the environmental impact and how you treat your workers, but the evidence suggests that these are financial things in the long term. So any investor should care about them, and hopefully that's what's going to be a permanent shift.
Good. So very specific question. Should government ministers be taking pay cuts as well? Should professional service firm partners be taking pay cuts? Tom, let me come to you first on that, and then maybe Alex is coming.
Yeah, well, naturally, professional services partners should be exempt from any pain and discomfort whatsoever. But I mean, in all seriousness, I can talk to what we're doing at PwC. So we have cut monthly distributions for partners, and we've decided that actually the partner profit pool should bear the burden of getting through this crisis. We're doing everything that we can to sustain employment. And I can't speak for the whole professional services sector, but I don't think that government support schemes were designed to protect professional services partner profit pools. And look, I think this principle of solidarity is really important. And I think we have seen, I think in New Zealand, government ministers have taken a 20% pay cut aligned with the furlough scheme. And I'm sure that this whole question of being in it together will grow in importance, because to some degree, although we're taking the GDP hit in this quarter, The employment hit will probably come in the next quarter in many countries as the various furlough schemes run out. And, I think that we're only at the very much in the foothills of the sort of political ramifications of all of this.
Got it. And there was also the question, should we be paying a bonus to NHS staff or rather than just giving them a clap every Thursday afternoon? For the non-UK people, this may not be quite such an easy question to get your head around. But Alex, do you want to say anything on that?
I would say yes. Is that what they're doing? Is they're doing huge things around here, and we often have the idea of responsibility being sort of minimal. So as a CEO, you can sign the business roundtable statement without making any difference. And some might say, well, clapping, that's something which is low cost. It's obviously good to show appreciation, but if the government really wants to show appreciation, then that would involve a bonus.
Understood. So here's an almost philosophical question. We're in a very interesting time, aren't we, where it is not the best to be a business owner. In other words, there are different categories of people. Some people are employed by the state. Some people are employed in private businesses. Some people are owning businesses. Some people are partners in professional services firms. It's not completely obvious who does best through this crisis in terms of having the best survival through it. Any thoughts on that question?
Yeah. I think it's a very interesting question, isn't it? And obviously, a number of small business owners have sort of fallen through the cracks of many of the government support schemes. And, those small owner shareholders who pay themselves through dividends have found themselves without any support at all. And I think that, with this being, a crisis following on so rapidly from really a rethinking of the role of business in society, I do think that business owners are feeling quite strong pressure to bear the brunt of some of the changes. And I mentioned what the profession, what we're doing at PwC in terms of the partner profit pool and trying to preserve employment. If you go back to some of the recessions of the 1990s, the professional services firms sort of drastically cut costs and did everything that they could to preserve profit. But I think that there was a recognition that actually led to long-term costs in terms of degradation of kind of talent pipelines and so on and so forth. So, I do still think that we're in a society where there are, great rewards can accrue to business owners. But it is a nerdy time to be a business owner. Not only are you having to bear the brunt of a lot of these changes, but of course, it's still completely unknown how this crisis is going to transform politics and the way in which governments regulate business. And we're going to have to figure out a way for paying all of this. And so there are likely to be consequences for business taxation and so on and so forth. So it's a challenging time for everybody, but most business owners have agency. Many of them have the ability, flexibility about how they organize their affairs and work. And that's still better than being in a position where you're just on the receiving end of this with very few.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to ask either of you if you want to sort of pick a question, because obviously we're not getting to all of them. How do we manage the increased target audience cynicism and good business story fatigue when communicating? So I guess this is a very sort of common question for you to worry about. How much of this is about the substance of the act and how much is actually about almost the PR of it? Any thoughts on that? Alex, do you want to?
I will give the standard professor response. It's a difficult question, but let me now elaborate on this. Is that what's interesting is responsible business is often contrasted with the Milton Friedman idea of the social responsibility of business is to maximize profits. But actually, those two things are much more aligned than people think, because even if your goal is only to maximize profits, then you would still want to be responsible, because that you build a good public relations image, you're going to make employees more loyal and so forth. So where responsibility is different is you're going to do things even if there is no side benefit. And say, okay, if a company was offering free online fitness services, maybe they're doing it for the PR because they're getting great advertising. People think, well, these fitness services mean they're good, so after the crisis is over, we're going to go to them. But that wouldn't suggest they would do other things, such as the storytelling idea. That they've never advertised it. I'm only telling you about it because I know this as a client. But I think what's genuine is if you're doing things purely to serve society, where there's not a clear benefit in terms of it promoting your business.
Good. Thank you. So does either of you want to pick a question? I mean, I'm putting you on the spot here. I have no idea what you're going to say, but if either of you in following the questions sees one that you like the look of, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, happy to pick one. I mean, loads of great questions, so thank you very much. I'm sorry we don't have another hour to respond to them all. But one that's quite interesting to me is this sort of suggestion that we've emphasised kind of material rewards and financial rewards to executives when, you know, surely executives are also intrinsically motivated to act for the good of their companies through the crisis. You know, and that's clearly correct. I mean, but although what's interesting is that people often say, well, we don't need to pay executives bonuses. And in fact, John Crine, the former CEO of Deutsche Bank, famously said that about himself, that he didn't need to be paid a bonus. But actually, the academic evidence is that financial incentives do matter, and it is important to construct them right. Notwithstanding that, I do also think that boards and shareholders, you know, do look at how senior leaders react in these sorts of situations. And shareholders are certainly very disappointed if the first conversation that they have is about adjusting bonuses or making sure they can pay out, and that they are looking for those CEOs that are intrinsically motivated and really wanting to do the best to lead their companies through this crisis. And I have to say that my personal experience was that boards were not focused on this executive pay issue at all at the start of this crisis. It was all about protecting employees, protecting the business. And, you know, pay really got thrust onto the agenda by external stakeholders when companies were going to leave that until later. So I do think that most CEOs do have a strong dollop of intrinsic motivation in these matters.
No, indeed. Alex, anything you'd like to add, either just as a general comment or a response to one of the questions?
Yeah, so there's a question, how do you find people's hidden talents within a business without evading privacy? And I think this is really interesting, and this is a shift in terms of employee management over the last 100 years. So the old view was that the goal of a manager was to squeeze as much as possible out of your workers, a bit like pie splitting. This is why the assembly line was so efficient, is that it made sure that workers kept up with the pace of production. But now there's a lot of work on the importance of empowerment, where we recognize that actually humans are not intrinsically lazy, right? If they're left to their own devices, they're not just going to be shirking, they're going to think proactively about how they can contribute to the company. And again, if we think about the silver linings of this really devastating crisis, we have a lot of people working from home. Are they going to be just on Netflix the whole day? Probably not. And if it seemed that people can go without supervision and create a lot of value, hopefully that will keep having an effect going forwards, because greater empowerment that you give to employees, this shows that they're actually using this to create some great ideas. So we know about Google's 20% time where they spend one day working on anything without supervision, but there's even much smaller examples. So the new Belgium brewing company, a socially responsible beer company, what they did, well, that's not an oxymoron actually. So what they did is they just allowed a lot of crowdsourcing. And so the employees said, we can reduce our carbon packaging in all of these ways. And this whole idea of empowerment, I think, is something which can really lead to rewards being reaped.
Perfect. I think that is a very good place to stop. Sada, if we could just get that final slide up, please. So we're going to close. And of course, it is fascinating to me to see these conversations about social responsibility, which of course are perennial issues in the business world, but to see them given a new twist, if you like, given the current pandemic and the current crisis. Before we close, let me just remind you that, of course, this series of webinars is continuing. The one on Thursday is the next one. Our colleague, Jeremy Gallien, who's Professor of Management Science and Operations, he's going to be talking about building a resilient supply chain, and of course the lessons from the current crisis. And if you'd like to know more about our additional line of webinars, you can see at the bottom of the screen there, london.edu/pandemic webinars. You will find that we've just released a further 5 webinars starting from next Tuesday with my colleague Randall Peterson. So with that, we are going to close. Remember that we are going to be making the video of this available to everybody online at that same website that you see there. Just a quick final thanks to Alex and Tom. Once again, thank you so much for sharing your insights on this fascinating issue.
Thanks very much, Julian. And also, if people have questions that they didn't get answered, then feel free to get in touch with us by LinkedIn. We'll also see whether there's a way of us exporting the questions, and then Tom and I might do a LinkedIn post answering the questions that haven't been answered.
Perfect. We will do that. Thank you, Alex, and thank you again, Tom. And we will close there. Thank you so much for listening and joining this webinar. Some fascinating stuff. And I will see you all again in a couple of days' time on Thursday. Thank you and goodbye.